Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm starting a new format. I'm calling it the Monthly Daly, in which I'm going to cut together Clare Daly's speeches that she gives at the European Parliament and present them to you in a curated 10 to 15 minutes format every month, and I'm going to start back in January 2023. I do that because I think Clare Daly is absolutely awesome. She's one of the few politicians in Europe with an actual spine in her back and with a lot of brain in her head, and who uses both of that to speak out and to be anti-colonial, to be pro-peace, to be against the warmongering, and for a sane version of the European Union and a sane approach towards international politics. So I will do some little commentary at the end, but now without further ado, please enjoy January 2023 Clare Daly.
Thanks, President. Once upon a time, human rights were about political and social rights: housing, healthcare, food, jobs. But of course, that challenged the economic order, and so social rights were edited out, and human rights became weaponised, a stick to beat our so-called geopolitical enemies. And every plenary we hunt for useful victims to demonise our rivals, while the victims that we create are never mentioned. And as my colleague said, perish the thought that the crimes of apartheid Israel against Palestinians would ever be mentioned. The Syrians tortured and murdered by US sanctions. The truth is, all people have rights by virtue of being human, but in here some are more human than others. The only country mentioned in the report is Ukraine. Why? There are unspeakable horrors taking place in Ukraine. They do deserve to be referenced, but little distinguishes them from the horrors elsewhere, except the colour of their skin and how much use we can make of them. And that's the truth about EU human rights policy. It's not authentic, it's just another facade for European chauvinism, a cloak for modern colonialism. Thank you, President. This policy is selling militarism as something to keep us safe, when in reality it's the opposite. It's militarism that's driving a dramatic rise in geopolitical tensions, drastically undermining our security. And you'd think that the Ukraine war would have shocked us out of this approach, but no. This report wants more of the same. Increases in heavy weapons to Ukraine, massive hikes in defence expenditure to a minimum of 2% of GDP, budget increases for arms through the Orwellian European Peace Facility, and the European Defence Union with no vetoes on defence decisions, overruling small states, not to mention an active mutual defence obligation, transforming the EU into a military alliance. And if that wasn't bad enough, we've more sanctions, more EU-NATO relations, more failed and destructive EU missions in Africa, on and on it goes. It's the policy of lunacy, trumpeted by a Parliament bedazzled by the military-industrial complex, and we reject this vision. Militarism and war are not and will never be a solution. We demand a Europe built on conflict resolution, on collective security, free from the old and the new divisions, where all states and countries are involved. A future of diplomacy, arms control, disarmament as the only real way to guarantee our security. Thanks, President. The fact that some of the charges against Irish activist Sean Binder were dropped last week is incredibly welcome, but my God, how did we ever get to this place where 24 volunteers and activists were on trial in Lesbos in a case spanning more than 4 years? Not to mention the fact that a far, far larger number of innocent migrants are currently squandering their time in prisons in Greece, charged with the crime of helping other people, an obligation in international law. And of course, it's not just Greece. Italy too criminalises humanitarian work. Latvia has just levelled criminal charges against 2 activists for helping Syrian refugees on the Belarusian border. It's disgusting. There's no other word for it, and it all has the tacit approval of EU governments and the European Commission, who know that EU money is being used to fund repressive apparatus on Europe's borders borders, violating the human rights of vulnerable people fleeing wars and climate change that we caused in the first place. And the same companies that benefit from this destruction benefit from the borders to keep them out. This is your Europe, and it's a very dark place indeed. Grazie, Presidente. So, Europe is all aflutter now with the new industrial strategy. The Swedish presidency has put competitiveness at the top of its agenda, and we hear Charles Michel telling Politico it's all about new ways of thinking and a can-do attitude. Well, God knows somebody needs to do something, because right now Europeans wake up every single day a little poorer than they were the day before. And will this strategy fix it? I have to say I have my doubts, because the problems facing us are much bigger than some tinkering around the edges of the state aid rules. The EU is currently doing everything it can to alienate our largest trading partner, China. It's hell-bent on fanning the flames of war in what used to be our largest gas supplier. Caught flat-footed by the new American protectionism and its energy gouging, we're flailing around now pretending we've a plan to stop Europe going underwater. Well, you can be absolutely guaranteed that unless you abandon neoliberalism, start examining renationalisation in the key areas of energy and infrastructure, then you're on a hiding to nothing. Thanks, President. 50 years ago, Ireland joined the European Union. Norway didn't. 50 years ago, 50 years on, Norway's fish exports are worth 14 billion, where Ireland's are worth £500 million. There's a direct link between the two. Ireland has had to suffer its third decommissioning scheme, slashing the size of its fleet, while Norway's keeps growing and growing. And the shafting of our fisheries as price for European Union membership has long been an open secret, but it's gone on long enough. It's long past time Irish fishers were given a fair share of our own waters. How is it right that Belgium has access to 67% of our sole, where we have only 3%? And despite the claims, 72 stocks in Irish waters, only 3 are overfished, and they're not overfished by Irish fishers. We need a review, we need the input of those who do the fishing, and we need a deal for the amounts not used. I voted for this motion. I oppose the death penalty categorically in any country it is used, and I abhor its use in Iran as part of a crackdown against people exercising their rights to shape their own country and its laws. But Iran has a valid desire to keep its sovereignty, but the approach it's now taking risks losing it. Meeting public anger and legitimate demands for reform with vicious state repression is not only horrific, it leaves dissenters with no peaceful options, pushing them underground, encouraging the resort to violence and opening the door for foreign interference, leading to the destabilisation of the country. Imperialist meddling is a fact, but it's not an excuse. The choice is stark: bend or break. If there is no justice for its victims and demands are not urgently addressed, then I am fearful for Iran's future. I would have supported the motion, but it goes far beyond what's acceptable in a human rights resolution. UN action is, of course, right. I support that, but colleagues here are throwing in geopolitical demands, trying to sabotage nuclear talks, dragging in the war in Ukraine, blocking constructive engagement and pushing for more failed sanctions that have only made things worse. So I voted against. I voted against this resolution. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a crime of aggression, and in a just world that crime would never go unpunished. But we find ourselves in a world of our own making. This March marks the 20th anniversary of the horrific crime of aggression against Iraq, perpetuated by the coalition of the willing, including our very own Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Netherlands, Denmark and Spain. I want to see war criminals punished, but after 20 years of impunity for the brigands who wrecked Iraq, the proposal before us is just pure fantasy. International law is upheld by consensus. It either applies to all states equally or it doesn't work. And those before us who move this motion, really the goal is not justice. It's to scupper peace, which is the only way to stop the slaughter now. If you want to put Putin behind bars, fine, but you've absolutely no credibility whatsoever unless you bring Bush, Blair and all his European counterparts with them. Thanks very much, President. I think there is an irony here that we're talking about sustainable investment funds against the backdrop of yet another scandal in terms of EU institutions. Fresh on the heels of the 𝗏𝗃𝗧𝗦 buying of influence, we've had the revelations of monthly allowances given to MEPs to pay for office supplies being used to purchase shares in arms, tobacco, mining and fossil fuel industries in order to finance a heavily indebted European Parliament voluntary pension scheme. And this included tens of thousands of shares in US arms industries which manufactured cluster munitions which were banned in 2008. And if that wasn't bad enough, some of the monies were being paid in offshore tax havens like Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. And the EU Observer revealed that the business strategy of our pension scheme was heavily reliant on fossil fuels. The investments came at a time when Parliament was passing resolutions to cut CO2 emissions. At the same time, our pension scheme held 5.2 million of shares in European petrochemical companies. So it's a case of do as I say, not as I do. Is it any wonder we have no credibility whatsoever? Thanks, President. The Global Gateway is, we're told, Europe's new flagship strategy to support infrastructures around the world and improve connectivity. But of course, as colleagues have so eloquently revealed, it is actually to woo away African and Global South countries from so-called Chinese and Russian influence. Not because we're the good guys and they need us, but because the Chinese are getting more value and economic benefit out of it than we are. So we want our slice of the action, and frankly it's pathetic. As a rival to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, it's a joke. 300 billion in investments basically rounded up by some private sector crowdfunding. The European Court of Auditors have slated it. A Eurodat report has said it's totally reliant on the private sector, total lack of transparency, not open to any scrutiny here because it's not rooted in legislation. We should be guided on international cooperation to deal with poverty reduction, fighting inequality and climate change rather than this geopolitical nonsense.
Well, isn't that quite something? A European Union built on conflict resolution, disarmament and arms control. Yes, that's exactly what the European continent needs. Thank you, Claire. And I was quite shocked to hear that humanitarian activism, especially when it's pro-Syrian and pro-Middle Eastern for refugees, that is basically criminalized at this point, or that you can be thrown in jail in the European Union if you help refugees that are not from Ukraine, but that are from other countries that the European Union doesn't deem to be worth to be saved and rescued. And also, she's absolutely right. China is important for the entire continent. We cannot just cut it out. It wouldn't make sense. And by the way, a new poll just came out recently that shows that a majority of European citizens is actually not in favor of taking sides if there ever was a conflict between China and the United States, that would rather maintain a neutrality in a US-China conflict, let's say over Taiwan, God forbid. The human rights discourse that she talks about, of course, it's being hijacked in order to fit in geopolitical purposes. That's what I deplore so much. Human rights discourse is very important. Human rights are very important, but the EU, the US, the West in general just has this tendency to use it in order to stick one to the nations that they don't like. That's why human rights only matter when it comes to Iran, when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia, but it didn't matter whatsoever in relations to Saudi Arabia or to Egypt. You know, Saudi Arabia can chop off the heads of 60 people in one day. I think they did that last year, and that's not a human rights issue for the European Union, but of course abusing Iran is an issue. That's why nobody believes this discourse anymore, because the EU and the US level it very, very specifically only against the countries that they don't like, and the countries that they are fine with, even if they're autocracies and even if they're huge human rights abuses, they don't say anything. That's why nobody believes it. And that goes into the last point that she made also about, you know, war criminals. Yes, the Vladimir Putin probably committed a war crime by attacking Ukraine, but so did Bush, so did Cheney, so did every single US president since the Second World War. Every single one of them, not necessarily crime of aggression, but I mean, crime of aggression quite often, and quite often also crimes in war, right? You can say whatever you want, but dropping atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki over civilian populations was a crime, a war crime already back in 1945, and torturing prisoners in Abu Ghraib, torturing prisoners in Guantanamo is still a war crime now. And the fact that we only talk selectively about war crimes is again undermining the entire discourse, and just makes everything useless, basically, because nobody, at least nobody, believes that anymore. I don't understand why politicians in the West still believe that we uphold human rights when we uphold them only selectively, and persecute war criminals only selectively. So thank you, Clare Daly, for very clear speeches. Stay tuned for the next Monthly Daily.